Imagine a world where the very air seemed poisoned, where entire villages stood silent except for the cries of the dying, where the rhythm of life was broken by the slow toll of church bells announcing yet another death. This was Europe in the mid-14th century, a continent caught in the grip of a shadow it could neither understand nor escape. They called it, at first, the Great Mortality. Later, we would know it as the Black Death, a name as heavy and foreboding as the dark reality it describes. Between 1346 and 1353, this invisible force swept across cities, towns, and countryside, leaving in its wake an emptiness that was more than just physical. It was spiritual, cultural, and historical. Some estimate that nearly half of Europe's population perished. Half. Think about that. Imagine looking down a crowded street, and then realizing that every second face you see will soon be gone. Sit back, relax, and let's journey into this dark chapter together. This is not just a story about disease, but about transformation. About how something as small as a flea bite could bend the arc of civilization itself. Because this wasn't merely a plague, it was a turning point in the history of humankind. And it begins far away from the bustling markets of Florence or the cobblestone alleys of London, in a place many had never heard of. Somewhere on the vast, windswept plains of Central Asia, where a microscopic enemy stirred in silence, waiting to be unleashed. But how did it travel so far, so fast? How did it breach the walls of kingdoms and empires, and seep into the very marrow of everyday life? Some believe it moved along the veins of trade, carried by merchants, rats, and ships. Others suggest the climate itself conspired to make the perfect breeding ground. Whatever the truth, the mystery of its beginnings only adds to the weight of what followed. Because the Black Death was not just an event, it was a rupture, a fracture in the story of humanity that changed everything. And as we move deeper into its path, one question lingers like smoke in the air. Was this destruction inevitable? Or was it a warning ignored until it was too late? To trace the story of the Black Death, we must leave the familiar cobbled streets of Europe and step into the vastness of Central Asia, a place of endless horizons, of winds that carry dust and whispers of forgotten empires. Here, historians believe, lies the cradle of the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. Somewhere in the shadow of the Tian Shan Mountains, in lands that were crossroads of caravans and conquerors, the plague first made itself known. Archaeological evidence from graves in Kyrgyzstan, dating back to 1338 and 1339, shows inscriptions that speak of sudden deaths and pestilence. Scientists who later studied the remains uncovered traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would soon unleash horror across continents. Yet even with this knowledge, the picture remains blurred. Some researchers suggest that climate shifts may have triggered ecological changes, forcing rodents from their natural habitats into closer contact with human settlements. Others propose that the Silk Road itself, that glittering artery of trade connecting China to the Mediterranean, acted as the perfect highway for disease. Each caravan, each ship, each merchant carried not only silks and spices, but also unseen passengers, fleas and rats, harboring death. Imagine the silence of a merchant camp at night, the flicker of a fire, the soft murmur of traders telling stories of distant lands. All the while, in the straw mats and cargo bundles, the plague germinated, biding its time. What makes this mystery deeper is that Asia had seen outbreaks before, long before the 14th century, and yet nothing had erupted on such a scale. Was this a perfect storm? Climate, trade, human movement all aligning at once? Or was there something more, something darker, something we still do not fully understand? By the early 1340s, whispers of disease had already reached the Black Sea, creeping toward the Crimean port of Kaffa, where Genoese traders conducted their business. It was here, some accounts claim, that the first sparks of Europe's nightmare were lit. But before we follow the plague onto ships and into Europe's heart, we must pause to consider the unsettling truth that humanity's greatest connectors trade. Travel, exchange were also its greatest vulnerabilities. The very roads that carried wealth and knowledge also carried death, and with every mile, the plague gathered strength, preparing to strike a world that was wholly unprepared. What happened next in Kaffa would forever change how wars were fought, how disease was feared, and how fragile empires truly were. In the year 1346, the Crimean port of Kaffa stood as a glittering jewel of trade, a Genoese stronghold nestled against the waters of the Black Sea. Merchants from across the Mediterranean crowded its docks, ships heavy with goods, voices rising in dozens of tongues, and the scent of spices, silks, and salt air hanging heavy. But beyond its walls, another force had gathered, an army of Mongol warriors, laying siege to the city in an effort to reclaim it. For months, the defenders held their ground, confident in their walls, relying on supplies smuggled in by sea. Yet, as the siege dragged on, something unexpected began to ravage the Mongol camp. Soldiers who only days before charged with ferocity now collapsed with fevers, swollen sores, and blackened flesh. Death spread through the army faster than any blade, cutting down thousands, leaving the besiegers weakened and desperate. It was here that legend takes a grim turn. Several chronicles from the time describe what may have been one of the first known cases of biological warfare. The Mongols, realizing their fate, began hurling the corpses of plague victims over the city walls. Imagine the scene, the thud of bodies crashing down into the narrow streets of Kaffa, the horrified cries of citizens as the air itself seemed to grow heavier with decay. Whether this act truly introduced the disease into Kaffa or simply accelerated what had already begun remains a matter of debate. But one thing is certain: within the city, the plague soon took hold. Panic spread as quickly as the sickness itself. Merchants and sailors, desperate to escape, boarded their ships and fled. Yet in their escape lay the seeds of catastrophe, for the ships did not sail empty. Hidden in the bilge, in the grain sacks, in the fur of rats, the plague traveled with them. From Kaffa, ships sailed westward, carrying their invisible cargo to Constantinople, to Alexandria, to Messina, and beyond. Each port became a doorway through which death entered, slipping silently into crowded markets and homes. What had begun as a local outbreak was now unshackled, bound for every corner of Europe and the Mediterranean. And as the sails of these ships caught the wind, one cannot help but imagine the eerie silence that followed them, as if the sea itself knew what horrors they carried. The siege of Kaffa was over, but the true war, the plague's war against humanity, was only beginning. Picture a fleet of merchant ships, cutting across the dark waters of the Mediterranean in late 1347, their sails taut in the wind, their decks alive with the chatter of sailors and the smell of salted fish and grain. To the casual observer, these vessels were lifelines of commerce, connecting distant ports, bringing wealth and goods. But hidden beneath the deckboards, in the shadows of the hull, lurked the true passengers, black rats, their fur crawling with fleas, carrying the plague, Bacterium Yersinia, pestis. When the ships from Kaffa reached their destinations, they carried not only silks, spices, and silver but death itself. The first major European port struck was Messina, on the island of Sicily. As the ships docked, people crowded the harbor, eager for goods and news from distant lands. Instead, they were met with a nightmare. Chroniclers describe sailors already dying on the ships, their bodies covered with boils, their breath labored, their skin turning a ghastly shade. Within days, the city was infected. Terrified, the authorities ordered the ships back to sea, banishing them from the port. But it was too late. Each port that turned these ships away only ensured the disease would spread further, from Messina to Genoa, from Genoa to Marseille, and from Marseille into the heart of France. It was unstoppable. Imagine the terror of seeing a ship glide into harbor, sails bright in the sun, but knowing that within its hold lurked a force that could wipe out your town in weeks. For some, the arrival of these vessels became an omen, the so-called ships of death. Priests prayed, magistrates gave frantic orders, but nothing stopped the contagion. The plague's spread was not random, it followed the arteries of trade. Wherever goods and people moved, so did the disease. Europe's interconnectedness, once its greatest strength, became its undoing. From the bustling Mediterranean coasts, the sickness crept inland, carried by merchants, travelers, and soldiers. By the end of 1347, it had entered Italy and southern France. By early 1348, it was in Spain and England. The Black Death had begun its march northward and westward, weaving a net of mortality that no city, no village, no monastery could hope to escape. As these ships disappeared over the horizon, carrying their invisible enemy onward, one chilling truth became clear. The age of containment was over. The plague no longer belonged to one city or one people, it belonged to the world. By the winter of 1347, the plague had already planted its roots in southern Europe, and with each passing month, it spread like a fire fanned by the winds of trade and travel. Italy, with its crowded cities and bustling ports, became one of the earliest and hardest-hit regions. Genoa and Venice, centers of commerce and power, saw their narrow streets fill with funeral processions, the air heavy with incense and the wailing of mourners. Chroniclers describe scenes almost impossible to fathom. Entire families wiped out in a matter of days. Neighbors too afraid to bury the dead, bodies left in homes or stacked along roadsides until they could be collected. From Italy, the disease moved inland and outward, riding with merchants across the Alps into France, where Marseille became one of the first great cities to fall. From there, it coursed through the Rhine Valley into Paris, and then into the Low Countries. The plague's march was relentless. By the spring of 1348, it had reached Spain, cutting through the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon with the same merciless efficiency. And then, across the Channel, came England's turn. The disease arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset during the summer of 1348, brought by ships from France. Within weeks, it spread to Bristol, and from there to London. The English capital, already crowded and unsanitary, was fertile ground for the sickness. Reports tell of carts rolling through the streets each morning, calling for the dead to be brought out, the sound of wheels and wooden planks echoing against stone walls. Monasteries, once places of healing and refuge, were not spared. Monks and priests died in numbers equal to the poor and the common. By the year's end, nearly every corner of Western Europe had been touched. It seemed as if the continent itself was unraveling. Borders meant nothing, wealth offered no protection, and prayers seemed to go unanswered. The plague did not discriminate, struck kings and peasants alike. rich merchants and starving beggars. Yet what is perhaps most chilling is not simply the speed of its spread, but the sense of helplessness it brought. There was no cure, no defense, only flight or resignation. And even for those who fled, the disease often followed. As Europe entered 1349, the question on every lip was the same. If no wall, no army, no sanctuary could stop this force, what would be left of the world when the dying was done? To understand why the Black Death inspired such terror, we must look closely at what it did to the human body. The most common form was the bubonic plague, named for the swollen lymph nodes or buboes that appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck. These swellings could grow to the size of an egg, hot and agonizing, sometimes splitting open and oozing pus and blood. Victims suffered fevers, chills, headaches, and exhaustion so severe that many could not rise from their beds. Death often came within days. But bubonic plague was only one face of this nightmare. In some, the infection traveled to the lungs, creating the pneumonic form, which was even more terrifying. Victims coughed up blood, their breath foul, their lungs drowning from within. Unlike bubonic plague, pneumonic plague could spread directly from person to person through droplets in the air. A cough, a breath, a whispered prayer near the dying could be enough to pass it on. And then there was the septicemic form, the rarest but most lethal. It spread in the blood, turning the skin dark with patches of gangrene, sometimes killing within a single day. To watch it unfold was to witness the body itself collapse under invisible assault. Imagine the fear of a mother watching her child develop a lump under the skin, or the horror of seeing a neighbor suddenly collapse in the street, his lips already turning black. People whispered that the air was poisoned, that God's wrath had descended, that evil spirits stalked their homes. No one could explain why some died in hours while others lingered for days, or why entire households perished while one child or servant survived untouched. The plague did not just kill, it mocked the very idea of safety or fairness. Doctors were powerless. They wore long robes, leather gloves, and strange beaked masks stuffed with herbs, hoping the scent would purify the air. Their tools leeches bleeding. Burning herbs were little more than desperate gestures against an enemy they could not see. And so, each day, the sick were carried to pits, their cries fading as the earth closed above them. This was not just as it was a spectacle of suffering that convinced many they were living through the end of the world. And as the death toll mounted, new questions haunted every survivor. Was this divine punishment, or something even darker, something humanity would never understand? As the plague tightened its grip, Europe's great cities, once alive with commerce, laughter, and the clang of bells, were reduced to hushed, haunted shells of themselves. Florence, Paris, London, Venice became cities of silence. Streets that only months before had been crowded with merchants and music, now echoed only with the creak of death carts and the tolling of church bells. Chroniclers describe entire neighborhoods abandoned, doors left ajar, windows shuttered forever. The stench of decay hung in the air, seeping into every stone and timber. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of how families deserted one another, fathers fleeing their children, wives leaving their husbands, all in the desperate hope of survival. Some locked themselves away, refusing contact with the outside world, while others sought out endless parties and indulgence, claiming that if death was inevitable, it might as well come in the midst of pleasure. Yet even behind locked doors, safety was an illusion. The disease crept in through servants, through trade, through a chance touch. In Venice, officials attempted one of the earliest forms of quarantine, confining ships for 40 days before allowing passengers ashore. Still, the sickness slipped through. Paris, the heart of medieval learning and faith, became a labyrinth of fear. The universities that once buzzed with debate grew quiet, their scholars dead or fled. Priests walked the streets carrying crosses and chanting prayers. Yet many themselves fell ill, their rituals powerless against the invisible foe. In London, the smell of lime used to cover mass graves mingled with the river's dampness. Digging pits became a daily routine, yet they could never be dug fast enough. Houses stood with corpses inside, neighbors too afraid to enter. The sound of footsteps at night could mean a body collector dragging away the dead. Or worse, thieves searching for valuables among the abandoned. To walk through a city in those years was to move through a liminal world, half living, half dead, where every cough could be a death sentence and every passing stranger a potential carrier. What was once familiar had become alien. These were not just cities, they were tombs in waiting. And as silence replaced laughter, many asked the same unsettling question. If this was the fate of the greatest cities, what hope was left for the villages and the countryside that lay beyond their gates? While the great cities fell under the weight of the plague, the countryside, those quiet villages scattered across fields and forests, was not spared. In fact, in many ways, rural communities faced devastation even more profound. Life in these villages had always been fragile, bound to the cycles of harvest, weather, and the labor of hands. When the plague arrived, it shattered this balance with brutal efficiency. A single infected traveler passing through, a merchant's cart stopping at an inn, or a priest visiting from another parish could ignite an outbreak. In villages, where families lived close, where animals shared space with humans, the sickness spread quickly, sparing no household. Entire communities disappeared, leaving behind only crumbling cottages and overgrown fields. Chroniclers speak of villages where every inhabitant was gone, their doors swinging open in the wind, hearths cold, and farmland left untended. Crops withered in the fields, sheep wandered without shepherds, oxen stood idle in their yokes. The countryside, once a landscape of order and labor, became a patchwork of silence. The effects rippled outward. With fewer hands to tend the land, grain shortages followed. Markets that once bustled with farmers selling their produce dwindled into emptiness. Lords who depended on peasants for labor found their estates collapsing. In England, some manors lost over half their workers, leaving fields fallow and rents unpaid. Yet within this devastation, something unexpected began to stir. With so few laborers left, peasants found themselves in a rare position of power. Wages rose, demands for better conditions followed, and the rigid structures of feudalism began to crack. But in the thick of the plague years, these shifts were only faint ripples, overshadowed by grief. Imagine the countryside at Dusker Hamlet, with smoke no longer rising from chimneys, the churchyard overflowing, a lone dog barking at empty roads. Survivors wandered between villages in search of food or kin, often finding only ruins. Even the landscape itself seemed changed, as if the fields and forests absorbed the sorrow of the dead. The plague did not distinguish between city walls and rural paths. It was an omnipresent shadow, reminding all who lived under it that no place, no matter how remote or peaceful, was beyond its reach. And as the villagers fell silent, another question began to haunt Europe. If even the countryside, the very backbone of survival, could collapse, how long could society itself endure? In the 14th century, the church was more than a place of worship. It was the very backbone of European life, the authority that explained the world, comforted the grieving, and guided the living. But when the plague swept across the continent, this foundation shook to its core. Priests, monks, and nuns moved among the sick, offering prayers and last rites. But many of them fell ill themselves, their robes no shield against infection. Monasteries, once seen as sanctuaries of learning and healing, were emptied, their cloisters echoing with absence. Parish priests, overwhelmed by the sheer number of deaths, sometimes performed mass burials without ceremony, whispering hurried blessings over piles of bodies. Faith, which once promised answers, now seemed to offer only silence. For countless believers, this silence felt unbearable. Why had God allowed such suffering? Was this punishment for sins, a divine reckoning upon a corrupt and sinful world? Some clung to that explanation, seeing the plague as God's anger made manifest. Others, watching the pious die as readily as the sinful, began to question the very order of the universe. If prayers could not stop the sickness, what power did the church truly hold? In some places, religious fervor deepened into desperation. Flagellant groups appeared, men marching barefoot from town to town, whipping their own backs until blood ran, believing their suffering might atone for humanity's sins and halt the plague. Crowds gathered to watch, some inspired, others unsettled by the intensity of their rituals. But as the plague continued, the church struggled to maintain authority. The clergy was decimated, suggests that in some regions, nearly half of all priests perished. Replacements were often hastily ordained, sometimes untrained, weakening the institution's credibility. Rumors spread of corruption, of priests demanding money for last rites, or abandoning their flocks altogether. Trust frayed, leaving a spiritual void. Yet, paradoxically, for some survivors, the plague deepened devotion. Cathedrals filled with candles lit for the dead, prayers multiplied, and art of the time began to obsess over death and the afterlife. The church endured, but it was not the same church that had stood before the plague. Its authority cracked, its aura of divine protection tarnished. And in those cracks, new ways of thinking, new voices, and new challenges to religious power began to stir. The Black Death had not only decimated the body, had infected the very soul of medieval Europe. But if faith faltered, where else would people turn for answers? When terror grips a people and explanations seem out of reach, suspicion turns outward. In the wake of the Black Death, this instinct took on a deadly form. Communities across Europe began to seek culprits, someone tangible to blame for the unseen hand of the plague. Whispers turned into accusations, and accusations erupted into violence. The Jewish communities of Europe, already marked as outsiders by centuries of prejudice, became the primary targets. Rumors spread that they had poisoned wells, corrupted the air, or conspired in secret to destroy Christian society. These stories spread like wildfire, carried by fear and ignorance, and soon mobs gathered in marketplaces and city squares. In Strasbourg, in February of 1349, the city's Jewish population was rounded up, herded into a wooden structure, and burned alive, their screams lost in the roar of the flames. Elsewhere, Jewish families were expelled, their homes seized, their possessions stolen. Entire communities were annihilated not by disease but by human cruelty, as persecution became its own kind of plague. Yet it wasn't only Jews who suffered. Foreigners, beggars, lepers, and even traveling merchants became objects of suspicion. Anyone who looked different, spoke with an unfamiliar accent, or carried strange goods could be accused of carrying the pestilence. Violence flared unpredictably, fueled by grief and anger with no clear target. To many, it seemed easier to strike at their neighbors than to admit they were powerless against the sickness itself. Some rulers and church officials tried to intervene, declaring that the accusations were baseless, that the plague was a punishment from God or a natural event beyond human control. Pope Clement VI issued decrees protecting Jewish communities, insisting they were not responsible. But in many towns, fear outweighed authority. In villages where nearly half the population had died, reason could not extinguish rage. And so the Black Death left scars not only of sickness, but of hatred, tearing apart the fragile bonds of trust between neighbors and deepening divisions that would echo through centuries of European history. It raises the unsettling question: in times of catastrophe, are we more likely to pull together or to turn against one another? The plague revealed both impulses and left behind a record of humanity's darkest reactions to fear. But if communities fractured under suspicion, others were forced to adapt in quieter, more practical ways. So how did daily life itself change under the weight of the Black Death? Imagine waking each morning to silence, where once there was the hum of voices, the clatter of carts, the ringing of church bells. In village after village, the Black Death reduced the living to shadows moving among empty homes, deserted fields, and shuttered markets. The routines of daily life, work, worship, trade crumbled beneath the sheer scale of loss. Farmers abandoned their land, either dead or too afraid to tend the soil. Crops withered unharvested, livestock wandered unattended, and granaries sat half empty. Hunger followed closely behind the plague, tightening its grip on the survivors. In the cities, the scene was even more surreal. Streets that once bustled with sellers and craftsmen grew eerily quiet. Merchants closed their shops, guilds collapsed as members perished, and apprentices were left without masters to teach them. Markets shrank, not only because of death, but because of fear. People avoided gatherings, terrified that a crowded space could mean their doom. Social rituals shifted as well. Weddings, once joyous affairs filled with music and feasting, became rare or subdued, sometimes held in haste before illness struck. Funerals, which had been community events, turned into hurried burials without mourning processions or elaborate rites. Families often could not bury their own, as entire households were struck down together. Death stripped away not only lives, but the very traditions that gave life structure. Yet, in these gaps, something new began to emerge. Survivors found themselves navigating a world where normal rules no longer applied. Servants demanded higher wages to work for masters who were desperate for labor. Widows, inheriting land or property, stepped into roles previously barred to them. Even children were thrust into responsibilities far beyond their years, managing farms, households, or small businesses left behind by their parents. The plague shattered continuity, but in doing so, it forced people to improvise. And amidst the sorrow, small acts of resilience flickered: neighbors sharing bread, strangers nursing one another, communities rebuilding from the fragments of what remained. Still, the rhythm of daily life never truly returned to what it had been before. A subtle awareness of fragility lingered in every task, from ploughing a field to lighting a candle at dusk. Each action carried the weight of uncertainty, as though the world itself might unravel again without warning. For those who survived, life was no longer something to be taken for granted, but a precarious gift, shadowed by memory. But how did this disruption of ordinary life transform the larger economic systems of Europe? That question leads us deeper into the next chapter of the plague's legacy. The Black Death did more than empty villages and silence marketplaces. It tore through the foundations of medieval Europe's economic structure, leaving behind a landscape that looked nothing like the one before. At the heart of this transformation lay labor. The plague killed indiscriminately, but its impact on the working classes was most profound. Fields that once thrived under the hands of peasants now lay fallow, and the great estates of nobles found themselves without the very people who sustained them. Where once a lord could rely on dozens of workers bound by feudal obligation, he now faced barren lands and no one left to plow or harvest. Scarcity created leverage. The surviving peasants suddenly realized their worth. Labor was no longer abundant. It was desperately sought after. In this reversal of power, peasants demanded wages, shorter hours, and even freedom from the ties that bound them to the land. And remarkably, they often received it. Nobles, desperate to avoid the collapse of their holdings, paid wages they once would have scoffed at. Entire communities saw living standards improve for those who survived, as opportunities opened up in ways unimaginable before the plague. But this newfound mobility sparked resentment among the ruling classes. Kings and lords attempted to clamp down with laws like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, which tried to freeze wages and bind workers back to their lords. Yet enforcement was nearly impossible. The plague had changed the balance of power, and no law could fully reverse it. This was the quiet beginning of the end for the rigid feudal system. Markets shifted to, with fewer mouths to feed, demand for food declined, driving down prices while the cost of labor rose. Some regions, especially those dependent on agriculture, saw wealth diminish, while others turned toward trade, crafts, and specialized industries. The seeds of a more diverse and dynamic economy were being sown in the ashes of the old one. Even artisans and craftsmen benefited, as guilds, once rigidly exclusive, opened doors to new members in order to replace their dead. Innovation crept in as necessity forced change. The plague, in its horror, became a strange engine of transformation. And yet, this was not a peaceful shift. Uprisings and revolts flared across Europe, as peasants who had tasted freedom clashed with rulers desperate to restore the old order. The plague may have brought economic opportunity, but it also sowed seeds of rebellion. The story of the Black Death was not only one of death, it was also the story of a new kind of society clawing its way into existence. But if the economy was reshaped, what of faith, the one anchor people thought unshakable? That unraveling would prove even more haunting. For centuries, the church had been the unwavering pillar of medieval life, a guide in both the sacred and the mundane. Its rituals marked birth, death, and everything in between. But when the Black Death swept across Europe, faith itself began to falter. In town after town, prayers and processions filled the streets. Incense burning thick in the air, bells tolling endlessly, but the plague did not stop. Priests stood at the bedsides of the dying, whispering final rites, until many themselves collapsed. Struck down by the same invisible force they promised could be warded off by divine power. The sheer scale of death overwhelmed the church's ability to respond. Graveyards filled, confession lines stretched for miles, and yet absolution seemed meaningless in the face of so much sudden annihilation. Some saw the plague as punishment from God, a divine wrath unleashed upon a sinful world. They spoke of humanity's pride, greed, and corruption as the fuel that had summoned this judgment. Flagellants, took to the streets groups of men and women who whipped themselves bloody in dramatic displays of penance, hoping their suffering might cleanse the sins of all. Crowds gathered to watch these rituals, desperate to believe in anything that might appease the heavens. Others, however, grew cynical. If God's representatives on earth, the priests, bishops, even the Pope, could not protect the faithful, then what did that say about the power of the institution? In regions where clergy died in overwhelming numbers, replacements were hastily ordained, often poorly trained, further eroding the church's authority. Superstitions bloomed in the vacuum. People wore charms, carried herbs, or sought the guidance of astrologers and fortune-tellers. Faith fragmented, shifting from collective rituals to personal survival. A creeping doubt began to spread. Had the church failed its flock, or had God turned away entirely? This crisis of belief did not immediately dismantle the church, but it planted seeds of skepticism that would echo for centuries. Some historians even argue that the cultural shock of the Black Death helped set the stage for the later Reformation, as people began to question the monopoly of spiritual power. In the silence left by unanswered prayers, humanity's relationship with the divine shifted. It was no longer simply about obedience, it became about questioning. And yet, while faith wavered, fear looked for an enemy. If God was not the cause, then who or what was? That search for a scapegoat would unleash its own horrors in the wake of the plague. When terror grips a people and explanations fail, suspicion becomes the weapon of choice. In the chaos of the Black Death, fear searched desperately for someone to blame. And tragically, entire communities became targets of persecution. The Jewish population, long marginalized in medieval Europe, bore the brunt of this frenzy. Rumors spread like wildfire that Jews had poisoned wells, conspired with dark forces, or called down the plague through secret rituals. In Strasbourg, 1349, thousands of Jews were rounded up, driven into wooden structures, and burned alive. In Mainz, Cologne, and countless other towns, pogroms erupted, erasing centuries of Jewish presence in days. These were not isolated outbursts, they were waves of violence fueled by fear, envy, and long-standing prejudice, given a deadly excuse by the plague. The tragedy was not limited to Jews. Strangers, beggars, lepers, and foreigners of any kind became targets. Anyone who looked different or lived outside the rigid norms of society became suspect. Lepers were accused of spreading disease deliberately, sometimes mutilated or killed. Travelers and outsiders were beaten, driven out, or executed, as though movement itself carried contagion. Witchcraft too was whispered in hushed tones. Women who lived alone, midwives, herbalists all, found themselves under suspicion. If prayers failed and the church faltered, then perhaps dark magic was at work. In some regions, trials and executions followed, feeding the fire of paranoia. What these persecutions reveal is not only the depth of medieval fear, but the fragile threads that held society together. When invisible death struck without reason, when no medicine or prayer could stop it, the human instinct was to search for a visible enemy, someone tangible to blame. The plague became more than a biological catastrophe, became a social weapon, turning neighbor against neighbor, faith into fanaticism, grief into violence. Some towns, however, resisted. There are accounts of leaders who tried to shield their Jewish populations, who insisted that the plague was not caused by poisoned wells, but by forces beyond human control. Yet their voices were often drowned out by mobs, by fire, by the roar of panic that refused logic. These dark chapters remind us that the Black Death did not only kill borders, it killed trust, fractured communities, and revealed the dangerous hunger for simple answers in the face of incomprehensible suffering. And yet, amidst the blood and suspicion, there were also acts of compassion, of care, of resilience. Ordinary people, left with nothing but each other, built small islands of humanity in the flood of terror. But what did daily life truly look like under the shadow of the plague? That question leads us deeper still into the lived experience of survival. To imagine daily life during the Black Death, you must picture a world suspended between silence and chaos. The ordinary rhythms of medieval existence, church bells marking the hours, the hum of markets, the laughter of children, were drowned out by the tolling of funeral bells, the cries of mourners, and the shuffle of death carts rolling through narrow, cobblestone streets. Entire families barricaded themselves indoors, fearing that even stepping outside might summon the sickness. Windows were shuttered, doors sealed, and streets often fell into eerie stillness, broken only by the sound of coughing from behind closed walls. For those forced to venture out, the city felt transformed. Men covered their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar or herbs, while physicians, clad in long dark robes with their infamous beaked masks, moved stiffly through the lanes. These masks, stuffed with aromatic plants, were meant to protect against the miasma, the poisonous air believed to carry disease. To see one approach was to glimpse both hope and horror. Trade and work crumbled. Shops closed, crops rotted in the fields, and the once bustling taverns and marketplaces turned into hollow echoes of themselves. Survivors scavenged what they could, sometimes looting abandoned homes, sometimes bartering food at staggering prices. The desperation of hunger mingled with the terror of contagion, creating a constant invisible pressure that weighed on every interaction. In some towns, death carts roamed daily, with men shouting, "Bring out your dead," as families hurriedly placed bodies wrapped in sheets onto the pile. Graves could not keep up with the flood of corpses. In some places, great pits were dug, filled layer upon layer with the dead, their presence masked only by the heavy smoke of burning incense and torches meant to purify the air. Yet, amid this bleakness, life also adapted in strange ways. Some communities turned to music, to drink, and to reckless celebration, believing the end was inevitable and that joy, however brief, might defy despair. Dances, feasts, and indulgence flared even as death stalked the revelers. This too was survival, an attempt to reclaim control, if only for a night. The world became a tapestry of contradictions, silence and noise, mourning and laughter, despair and resilience. Every moment carried a tension between the dread of death and the stubborn will to live. And within this fragile balance, stories of survival, of strange cures, of miracles and madness that would linger long after the plague's shadow receded. But to truly understand the desperation, we must step into the realm of medicine and superstition, where belief and science clashed in the hunt for a cure. In the 14th century, medicine was a fragile science, resting as much on tradition and superstition as on observation. When the Black Death struck, physicians and healers searched for explanations. But what they found was less truth and more conjecture, theories woven together from fragments of ancient texts and desperate imagination. Many clung to the belief, in miasma, that the plague was carried by foul air, thick with corruption. To combat it, people burned herbs, carried pomanders filled with rosemary or lavender, and lit great bonfires in the streets, hoping the smoke would drive away the poison. Others recommended bathing in vinegar, drinking concoctions of crushed emeralds, or balancing the body's humors through bloodletting, a treatment that often weakened patients further. The image of the plague doctor with his long beaked mask embodies this strange marriage of superstition and medicine. The mask's beak was stuffed with strong-smelling herbs thought to filter the air, while the physician's cloak, hat, and gloves were meant to shield him from contagion. To the people of the time, these doctors were both a source of hope and a grim omen, their very presence a reminder of death's nearness. Some cures bordered on ritual. Patients were told to place frogs or chickens on their swollen buboes, believing the animals would draw out the poison. Others sought astrological explanations, claiming that the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 had poisoned the Earth's atmosphere. Remedies were prescribed accordingly, ranging from charms and amulets to prayer cycles and pilgrimages. And yet, amid these strange attempts, there were glimmers of practical wisdom. Some cities, like Venice, began experimenting with quarantine-forcing ships and travelers to wait 40 days before entering, in a desperate attempt to contain the spread. Though the science was not fully understood, this measure proved one of the few effective responses of the age. Still, for most people, medicine offered little more than false hope. The plague was relentless, and no herb, no star chart, no bleeding or burning could halt its march. But these attempts reveal something deeply human: the refusal to surrender, the need to act, even when the enemy was invisible and unstoppable. It is here, in the strange blend of reason and fear, that we see how the Black Death tested not only the body but the mind, reshaping how humanity understood health, disease, and survival itself. And as treatments faltered, attention turned inward, toward the individual body and soul, questioning what it meant to live in a world where tomorrow was no longer promised. The Black Death did not just erode flesh, it gnawed at the very foundations of the human spirit. To live during the plague was to exist in a constant state of dread, where every cough, every ache, every shadow cast across the skin could herald the end. Fear became an ever-present companion, reshaping behavior, thought, and even morality. Some people withdrew completely, shutting themselves inside their homes, avoiding neighbors, refusing to touch or speak to anyone beyond their walls. Suspicion seeped into daily life, friends hesitated to greet one another, families avoided. Gathering and the simplest acts of kindness became fraught with danger. A loaf of bread shared, a hand extended in comfort each, could carry death. Others reacted differently, embracing fatalism with almost reckless abandon. If death was inevitable, then why not feast, sing, and drink? Taverns in some towns overflowed, with people indulging in excess, laughing in the very face of mortality. This strange carnival of despair revealed a truth about the human psyche. When stripped of certainty, it oscillates between fear and defiance. Religion, too, shaped responses. For many, the plague was God's judgment, and their minds turned to guilt and penance. Guilt was not only personal, but collective. Entire cities staged processions, whipping themselves in public displays of suffering, hoping divine mercy would follow. For others, though the silence of heaven bred resentment and doubt, hollowing out the faith that had once anchored their lives. Children grew up in this atmosphere of uncertainty, watching parents wither, listening to the tolling of bells that never seemed to end. For them, the plague became the air they breathed, normalizing a world where graves were dug deeper than hopes, and tomorrow was always in question. It was a formative trauma, reshaping generations. Yet amid the despair, resilience flickered. Neighbors still risked their lives to care for one another. Parents still tried to protect their children. And communities, though fractured, found moments of solidarity. Humanity endured not because fear vanished, but because people learned to live with it, to balance dread with duty and sorrow with survival. In this way, the psychology of the Black Death became a paradox, despair and hope intertwined, fear and courage inseparable. But even as individuals wrestled with inner battles, entire cities and states were reshaped, forced to rethink governance, authority, and the very fabric of public life. The question was no longer just how to survive, was how to rule a world half emptied of its people. As the Black Death hollowed out Europe, it was not only individuals who faced collapse. Entire cities and kingdoms staggered under the weight of loss. Imagine Florence, Paris, or London, once vibrant hubs of trade and culture, now reduced to eerie landscapes of shuttered shops and abandoned homes. Municipal governments, already fragile, found themselves unable to maintain order, with officials dying as swiftly as common laborers. Councils met less often, decrees went unenforced, and laws became words without power. In many places, the streets were ruled not by authority but by necessity, families looting to survive, gangs forming to take what they could, and fear undermining the very idea of community. Rulers and monarchs, too, faced impossible challenges. Kings who once projected power now found their treasuries drained, their armies decimated, and their subjects questioning the legitimacy of those who could not protect them. Some monarchs attempted to tighten their grip, issuing laws to freeze wages, control movement, and restore order. Others fled their capitals altogether, retreating to remote estates in a desperate bid to escape infection. The optics of such flight did not go unnoticed. Subjects began to wonder what kind of leaders abandoned their people in their darkest hour. Yet, out of this chaos, new forms of governance began to emerge. In Venice, strict quarantines were enforced with military precision, laying the groundwork for public health systems that would echo into modern times. In Milan, entire houses were sealed shut when plague appeared inside, brutal but effective at containing spread. These were harsh measures, but they represented the birth of organized, state-led responses to disease. Cities began keeping records of deaths, experimenting with sanitation, and even controlling trade in ways that reflected a growing sense of civic responsibility. The plague also altered warfare and diplomacy. With populations halved in some regions, armies shrank, battles stalled, and political ambitions were reshaped by sheer lack of manpower. Yet, ironically, for some rulers, the devastation opened new opportunities. Empty lands could be seized, weakened rivals could be overtaken, and shifting demographics created unexpected alliances. The Black Death, in this way, was not only a destroyer but also a catalyst, accelerating the evolution of governance from feudal obligation towards something more centralized and bureaucratic. Still, behind every policy was the inescapable truth: power itself had been humbled. No king, no council, no city wall could stop the plague. And that sobering reality forced rulers and citizens alike to look beyond earthly power, to ask what kind of world might emerge when the old order no longer held. But before that new order could take shape, art and culture began to absorb the plague's shadow, reshaping how humanity expressed itself in the face of endless death. When words failed to capture the enormity of the Black Death, art stepped in to give form to the silence, the grief, and the terror that clung to every street and every home. Medieval Europe's painters, sculptors, and writers began to weave death directly into their creations, transforming culture into a mirror of catastrophe. Before the plague, much of art was devotional, centered on the glory of saints, the majesty of Christ, and the promise of paradise. Afterward, those same altarpieces and murals became darker, more haunting, obsessed with mortality and the fragility of life. The theme of the Danse Macabre, the dance of death, emerged during this period, showing skeletons leading kings, peasants, and clergy alike into a grim procession. These images told a blunt truth that everyone had witnessed. Death made no distinction, sparing neither the powerful nor the poor. Murals of rotting corpses, writhing demons, and decaying flesh appeared not just in churches, but in public squares, confronting people with what they could not escape. Literature, too, absorbed the shadow. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron painted a vivid picture of a world where young nobles fled to the countryside to escape the plague, telling stories to distract themselves while Florence crumbled around them. In England, poets like William Langland infused their works with themes of social upheaval and divine judgment, reflecting the spiritual and cultural unease of the time. Even music changed. Funeral hymns multiplied, but so too did strange, joyous songs written for those who chose revelry over despair, embodying the same contradiction that played out in daily life. Art became both a warning and a release, in an attempt to make sense of devastation, and at the same time to wrest beauty or meaning from its grip. Beyond the horror, creativity itself flourished in new ways. Artists experimented with realism, with capturing the details of human suffering and the physical world in sharper focus than before. Some historians suggest that the trauma of the Black Death helped accelerate the cultural transformations that would later bloom into the Renaissance. The plague, in a paradox, not only destroyed but also inspired. It forced humanity to look directly at death, to confront its universality, and in doing so, to search for new forms of expression that spoke to both suffering and survival. And yet, art was only one piece of the legacy. The deeper transformation unfolded slowly, in the fabric of society itself, reshaping how families, classes, and entire communities understood their place in a world forever altered by the plague. The Black Death did not only dismantle kingdoms and churches, it shattered the most intimate bonds of all those of family and community. In a world where survival itself hung by a thread, even the closest ties were tested to their breaking point. Reports from chroniclers described children abandoned by their parents, husbands fleeing their wives, and siblings refusing to care for one another, terrified that love itself could be a death sentence. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote of houses where servants left the sick to die alone, and of neighbors who bolted their doors, unwilling to risk a knock that might bring contagion inside. Communities that had once gathered in tight circles of trust dissolved into islands of isolation, each household retreating into itself. Yet not all bonds broke. In countless villages, families clung together, nursing one another even when the outcome seemed certain. Parents held their fevered children until the last breath, and children tended to their aging mothers and fathers, embodying a kind of courage that defied the plague's terror. Stories of small acts of neighbors leaving bread at each other's doors, of strangers digging graves for those they had never known, emerged like flickers of light in a vast darkness. Still, the impact of the plague was merciless. Whole lineages vanished, their names erased from parish records in a single season. Orphans roamed the streets, some taken in by monasteries or distant relatives. Others left to wander as beggars, reshaping the very makeup of medieval society. Communities fractured along new lines, where villages lost half or more of their population. Survivors sometimes merged with other towns, abandoning old homesteads to ruin. In cities, the absence of familiar faces reshaped neighborhoods, leaving once crowded quarters hauntingly empty. The loss of priests, teachers, and elders meant that knowledge, both spiritual and practical, vanished with them, creating gaps in memory that would echo for generations. Yet out of this ruin came resilience. Families rebuilt, communities reformed, and new bonds were forged between survivors who recognized that, in a world so fragile, trust was both rare and necessary. The Black Death revealed the terrible cost of fear, but also the stubborn endurance of human connection. To lose family was to lose one's world, yet from those losses grew new definitions of kinship and community. But if family ties were remade in the ashes, so too were the larger structures of power, the great divide between rich and poor, noble and peasant, began to crack under the weight of death. And the struggle for equality was only just beginning. When the plague emptied fields and workshops, it left behind a silence that was more than just grief, was the silence of an economy brought to its knees. Fields went untilled, mills stood idle, and cities once humming with trade grew eerily quiet. In England, whole villages were abandoned, their houses overtaken by weeds. In France, the vineyards that had long filled barrels with wine rotted under the sun for lack of hands to harvest them. Across Europe, laborers were no longer plentiful, and this sudden scarcity shifted the balance of power in ways few could have foreseen. Peasants and craftsmen, once treated as expendable, suddenly became valuable. Landowners, desperate to keep their estates productive, found themselves competing to attract workers, offering higher wages, better living conditions, and even food to secure loyalty. For the first time in centuries, the poor held leverage over the wealthy, and their voices grew louder with each passing season. But power never shifts without resistance. Kings and lords, alarmed at this upheaval, imposed strict wage controls, attempting to freeze society in its old shape. England's Statute of Labourers in 1351 ordered that no man should be paid more than he had earned before the pestilence, no matter how scarce his labour. The punishment for disobedience was harsh, but the law itself revealed the growing fear among the ruling elite that the very order of feudal society was unravelling. Workers, however, were not so easily silenced. Some abandoned their lords altogether, wandering in search of better pay. Others joined together in rebellion, as in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when men and women alike rose against the taxes and controls that sought to bind them to poverty. The Black Death, without ever intending to, had planted the seeds of revolution. The land itself reflected the shift. Estates once divided into narrow strips of subsistence, farming began to consolidate into larger fields, with fewer tenants and more efficiency. Sheep farming expanded, as wool could be tended by fewer people and sold for profit abroad. In towns, guilds of craftsmen gained new influence. Their numbers reduced, but their bargaining power greater than ever before. What began as a catastrophe slowly reshaped Europe's economy into something new, something more flexible, and something less tied to the rigid hierarchies of the past. Yet the question lingered like a shadow: how much change could the old world endure before it shattered entirely? The plague was not only a physical terror, it was a spiritual earthquake. In an age when faith framed every moment of life, the Black Death forced people to ask questions they had never dared to voice aloud. Why would God allow such suffering? Why did the innocent perish as swiftly as the guilty? Why did the prayers of priests, the rituals of the church, and the relics of saints fail to halt the tide of death? For many, the silence that followed these questions was more frightening than the plague itself. In churches across Europe, the altars remained, busy candles burned, bells rang, masses were said for the souls of the departed, but the priests themselves were dying as fast as their flocks. Entire parishes were left without clergy, and those who remained often fled from their duties, too fearful to offer last rites. Chroniclers record that in some towns the dead lay unshriven, their souls commended to heaven by desperate family members rather than ordained ministers. Such abandonment fueled doubt. If the shepherds of Christendom abandoned their flocks, then what did that say of the Church's power? Some turned to extreme piety, joining processions of flagellants, who whipped their own backs bloody in the belief that their suffering might appease God's wrath. The sight of hundreds marching barefoot through towns, chanting hymns while scourging themselves, was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a theater of devotion that spread across Europe like a shadow parallel to the plague. Others fell into suspicion and rage. They sought scapegoats, accusing Jews of poisoning wells or conspiring to spread the pestilence. These accusations ignited horrific massacres, as entire Jewish communities were burned alive or driven from their homes, victims of fear twisted into violence. Yet, alongside despair, there was also a quiet defiance. Some whispered that perhaps the Church's promises of divine protection were hollow, that the institution which claimed authority over salvation had no more power over the plague than a village healer or a mother's prayer. In these murmurs lay the earliest cracks in the Church's towering, authority cracks that centuries later would widen into the Reformation. The Black Death did not erase faith, but it changed it. It made belief more personal, more desperate, and more questioning. And as faith fractured, so too did the old certainty that the world was governed by a fixed and divine order. The plague had forced people to see that even sacred institutions could fail, leaving them to wonder what other truths might one day crumble. The plague did more than take lives. It tore at the very fabric of society. Laws, traditions, and obligations, things that once seemed unshakable beneath the weight of death. Entire manors stood empty, their fields untended, their harvests rotting in the sun. Peasants who survived suddenly found themselves in a world without lords, without overseers, and without the strict chains of feudal order binding them. In many regions, the death toll was so severe that the ruling class simply could not enforce old hierarchies. Land went fallow, villages shrank into silence, and roads once bustling with merchants were deserted. For some, this collapse was a curse. Famine stalked the land as food supplies dwindled. Trade routes became dangerous, and bandits emerged to prey on the vulnerable. Yet, for others especially, the survivors among the working poor, the plague was a dark, twisted liberation. With so many laborers dead, the demand for workers soared. Those who once toiled as near slaves in the fields now discovered their labor was valuable. They could demand higher wages, better conditions, or simply walk away to another town in search of opportunity. The rigid structure of feudalism cracked, and though lords tried to reassert control with laws that froze wages and restricted movement, these decrees were impossible to enforce when half the countryside lay in graves. In towns and cities, guilds of craftsmen also faced upheaval. With masters and apprentices alike lost to the plague, traditional lines of authority within trades broke down. Newcomers seized positions, widows inherited businesses, and the old rules of craft and commerce bent under necessity. This shift created new tensions, but also opened doors for those who had long been excluded. Yet, not all embraced these changes. The ruling classes, desperate to maintain their dominance, often turned to brutality. Rebellions erupted across Europe, rising against nobles in France, England, and beyond. These uprisings were fueled by hunger, anger, and the sense that the old order no longer served the living. Though most were crushed with savage violence, they signaled a truth that could not be buried. The world after the Black Death would never again be the same as it was before. What the plague destroyed was not only lives, but the illusion of permanence. Systems that had seemed eternal revealed their fragility. And out of the ruins of feudal order, a new, uncertain Europe began to take shape. The plague had rewritten the balance of power, and no lord, no king, no priest could fully restore the world that had been lost. For centuries, the Church had been the unquestioned guide of Europe, the voice of comfort in times of hardship, the bridge between life and the afterlife. Yet, when the plague swept across the continent, even the authority of the Church could not withstand its force. Priests and monks, once revered as spiritual protectors, fell in staggering numbers. Monasteries that had stood for generations were left hollowed, their cloisters silent, their bells no longer rung. Pilgrims who once sought holy relics or sacred shrines for healing returned empty-handed or did not return at all. People who had looked to God for salvation now looked upon empty altars and locked chapels, asking questions the Church could not answer. Why had prayer not stopped the dying? Why did holy water not protect the faithful? Why did the plague strike priest and pauper alike? For some, this crisis deepened faith. Flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in desperate attempts to atone for humanity's sins, hoping their suffering might appease a wrathful God. For others, faith turned to fury. Priests who demanded tithes, even as their flocks starved, were denounced as greedy. Bishops who fled their dioceses to escape infection were condemned as cowards. Rumors spread that the Church's wealth and corruption had invited divine punishment, that God was revealing the hypocrisy hidden beneath gilded cathedrals and jeweled altars. This suspicion left scars. Confidence in the spiritual authority of Rome waned, and ordinary believers began to question whether the Church alone held the keys to salvation. In some regions, desperate communities accused outsiders, minorities, or even supposed heretics of bringing the plague, fueling persecutions that revealed the fragility of social trust. The silence of the Church during the plague years created a space for new ideas, for alternative voices. Mystics claimed to receive visions, laypeople formed their own devotional movements, and whispers of reform echoed faintly in the margins of European society. Though the Church remained powerful, the certainty of its dominance was broken. Seeds of doubt had been planted in soil fertilized with death. Centuries later, those seeds would grow into challenges that shook the very foundation of Christendom. But in the darkest days of the Black Death, all most people felt was abandonment, chilling silence from the very institution they had trusted to protect them from despair. And into that silence crept a question that lingered in every empty chapel. If the Church could not shield the faithful from the plague, then what power did it truly hold? In every corner of Europe, the plague left behind a haunting silence, but nowhere was it louder than in the voices of children who never grew up, or those who did, carrying the weight of absence. Streets that once rang with laughter were suddenly quiet, schoolyards emptied, and lullabies fell mute in homes where parents no longer lived to sing them. Entire generations were scarred by the sudden vanishing of family lines. Some children were orphaned in a single week, forced to wander from door to door in search of scraps or to fall under the mercy of distant relatives who themselves were barely surviving. Others were left with property, land, or small inheritances, thrust into adulthood with responsibilities they had no time to understand. In towns, makeshift groups of children banded together, becoming ragged survivors in a world that seemed too cruel for their fragile years. Chroniclers recorded the eerie sight of villages where the only living figures were children, too young to till the fields or defend themselves, clinging to life amidst crumbling homes. The psychological toll was deep. To grow up during or after the plague was to grow up with the constant shadow of death. To learn too early that stability was an illusion. Children were told stories of the great pestilence that carried away parents and neighbors in carts, that closed schools and emptied churches, that forced them to sleep at night in homes too quiet, too large, too haunted by memory. Yet out of this bleakness, resilience took root. Some of these children, hardened by grief and survival, became the men and women who later reshaped Europe. They knew the world could collapse overnight. So they lived with a hunger for opportunity, unwilling to accept the rigid limitations of the old feudal order. Their imaginations, once shaped by the trauma of loss, grew restless and bold. These were the generations that pushed for reform, that sought new lands across the oceans, that questioned authority and reached for new answers in science, trade, and governance. Still, beneath their ambition lay the echo of loss. A song never sung, a game never played, a parent never embraced again. The Black Death did not only kill millions, it stole childhoods, reshaped identities, and left Europe with a generation that would never forget what it was to live in the shadow of so much death. And so, the world that followed was not simply rebuilt by survivors, was rebuilt by children, who had learned too soon what it meant to lose everything. As the years stretched into decades, the Black Death refused to fade into the past. It lingered not only in the scars upon the land, but in the collective memory of those who endured it. Families told stories around the hearth of how loved ones vanished, of nights when the air itself felt poisoned, of the tolling of bells that never seemed to stop. These stories were passed down like heirlooms, each retelling carrying both a warning and a reminder. In towns that rebuilt, memorials were raised crosses on hilltops, painted frescoes of the Danse Macabre, showing skeletons leading kings and peasants alike in a grim procession. Art became an echo of trauma. Skeletal figures peered from the edges of manuscripts. Hourglasses and skulls reminded viewers of life's fragility, and entire genres of painting and poetry revolved around death's certainty. Memory was etched into architecture too. Churches rebuilt after the plague bore darker, more somber tones. Graveyards expanded beyond their limits, overflowing into fields that once grew wheat. Even when outward life began to resemble normalcy, an invisible weight remained. Generations born after the plague still grew up beneath its shadow, inheriting a culture of caution and fear of sudden catastrophe. Yet the memory of the plague was not uniform, it varied across regions. In some places, it was spoken of in hushed tones, a wound too raw to discuss. In others, it became a tool of authority, invoked by priests as evidence of divine punishment, or by rulers as a reminder of society's fragility under chaos. Chroniclers preserved accounts with a mixture of awe and horror, ensuring the calamity would not be forgotten. And even centuries later, when Europe faced new outbreaks of plague, the memory of the great mortality haunted every response. The shadows of memory shaped decisions, behaviors, and beliefs. They urged some to cling tighter to religion, others to pursue knowledge in medicine and science, and still others to challenge the very systems that had failed them. To remember the Black Death was to carry a reminder that life could be undone overnight, that wealth, power, and status meant nothing when the pestilence arrived. It was a memory both terrifying and galvanizing, a memory that whispered through cathedrals, markets, and farm fields alike. And as the 14th century gave way to the 15th, those shadows of memory ensured that the Black Death was never merely an event in history, was a presence, a ghost that Europe could never truly escape. By the time the plague's first great wave finally loosened its grip, the world it left behind was unrecognizable. Villages lay empty, their fields overtaken by weeds, their cottages collapsing into silence. Cities, though still standing, had been reshaped, streets wider now because whole rows of houses had vanished. Markets quieter because so many merchants were gone. But within this devastation, something new stirred. The immense loss of life had torn down barriers that had seemed immovable. Peasants demanded rights once denied to them, craftsmen found room to rise in status, and women stepped into roles that society had once forbidden. It was as though the rigid bones of the old world had cracked, leaving space for something different to grow. Economies shifted. Wages rose in many places, mobility increased, and entire classes of people began to imagine futures that stretched beyond the confines of feudal loyalty. The plague did not end, suffering famines continued, wars raged, but it forced transformation. Knowledge, too, began to move in new directions. Healers and scholars, unsatisfied with prayers alone, sought more practical answers. The seeds of medical observation and scientific curiosity began to take root. Fragile but persistent, as Europe realized that faith alone could not shield it from disaster. Even art and literature reflected this rebirth. Grim reminders of mortality gave way, in time, to works that embraced human experience more fully, setting the stage for what would one day be called the Renaissance. Yet the most profound change was not seen in stone or parchment, but in the minds of the survivors. Once they had lived in a world defined by permanence, where church, crown, and custom were unshakable pillars, the plague shattered that illusion. They had witnessed the collapse of order, the silence of authority, the fragility of life itself, and from that knowledge grew a new way of seeing the world, one marked by uncertainty, but also by possibility. The Black Death was more than a catastrophe. It was a turning point, a dark forge in which the future of Europe was hammered into shape. It left scars that never fully healed, memories that never faded, and questions that still echo across centuries. How does humanity rebuild when half its world has been taken? What rises from the ruins when everything familiar has fallen away? The answers, whispered in the aftermath, shaped not only the generations that survived, but the course of history itself. For the Black Death had not merely ended lives, it had remade the world forever.